Have you ever stopped to think how one of the most powerful and ancient empires in history is directly connected to the Bible? That is exactly what happens with the Persian Empire, a kingdom that ruled vast lands and played a crucial role in various prophecies and biblical stories. Famous kings such as Cyrus and Darius not only appear in the sacred pages, but completely changed the destiny of the Jewish people. But what happened to this great empire over the centuries? How did it disappear and transform into the modern-day Iran we know today? Get ready, because in this surprising story, you will discover secrets, battles, fulfilled prophecies, and how an ancient biblical empire evolved to become one of the most influential nations in the Middle East today. First, we need to go back in time, all the way to the beginning, when the waters of the flood had receded and the earth was once again ready to be inhabited. In chapter 10 of Genesis, the Bible presents the Table of Nations, a list of the descendants of the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Each of them gave rise to peoples who would spread across the earth, forming the civilizations we know today. Among the sons of Shem, a name appears that might go unnoticed at first glance: Elam. Elam was one of the first Semitic peoples mentioned in the scriptures. His descendants settled east of Mesopotamia, in a mountainous region southwest of present-day Iran. The land of Elam was strategic, fertile, protected by mountains and crossed by rivers, favoring agriculture, trade, and the growth of fortified cities. It was there in that quiet and nearly forgotten region today that a civilization began to grow, one that would later become the protagonist of one of the greatest empires of ancient history, the Persian Empire. For centuries, the Elamites lived as a regional power. They had armies, kings, and well-established cities such as Susa, which would later become a Persian capital. They appear sporadically in the Bible as a neighboring people, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies of Israel. But it was over time, and especially with the arrival of the Medes and Persians, that the fate of Elam changed drastically. The Medes, who came from regions farther north, joined with the Persians, who descended from Elam and other local peoples. This union, first cultural and then military, gave rise to a strong and centralized kingdom. It is in this context that Cyrus the Great emerges, a name that would change the course of the history of Israel and the world. Few moments in biblical history are as impressive as what happened in the days of King Cyrus the Great. Imagine the scene. The people of Israel had been taken captive to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. Jerusalem was in ruins. The temple, which had once symbolized the presence of God among his people, had been plundered, burned, and destroyed. For 70 years, the Jews lived far from their land, carrying with them the pain of exile and the hope of one day returning. And it is in this dark context that God decides to act in a completely unexpected way. What no one could have imagined was that Israel's liberation would come not through a Jewish prophet, nor by an uprising among the exiles, but through a pagan king. A man who did not know the God of Israel, but who was called by him my shepherd and my anointed. That man was Cyrus, king of Persia. The Bible does not merely recognize Cyrus as a historical figure, it goes beyond that. In Isaiah chapter 45 verse 1, God calls him my anointed one, something extremely rare for someone who was not even part of the people of Israel. The most astonishing part is that this prophecy was written about 150 years before the birth of Cyrus. Isaiah, inspired by God, described in detail the role that this Persian king would have in the future. He would defeat Babylon and free the Jewish exiles, allowing them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. The Bible records this crucial moment clearly and directly in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 22 and 23, and in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. The author makes it evident that this was not merely a political or military decision, it was God himself who stirred the heart of Cyrus. The text says, "The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia." And what was the result? Cyrus issued a decree that would forever change the history of the people of Israel. He proclaimed that all the Jews who wished could return to Jerusalem. More than that, he ordered the temple of God to be rebuilt, and he offered financial help, utensils from the former temple, and even protection for the journey. This was not common. It was unprecedented. A foreign king, ruling an empire that stretched from the Indus River to Egypt, was publicly supporting the worship of the God of Israel. Cyrus returned the sacred utensils that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple: basins, cups, bowls, objects made of gold and silver. Everything was carefully counted and handed over to the Jewish leaders to be used once again in the worship of the Lord. It was as if God were restoring not only the physical temple, but also the dignity and identity of his people. Thousands of Jews prepared for the long journey back to their land. They left Babylon with renewed faith and a sense that God was still with them. The leadership of men like Zerubbabel, who led the first group of exiles, and later Ezra and Nehemiah, would be essential in rebuilding Jerusalem. But none of that would have been possible without divine intervention through the king of Persia. The most fascinating part is that this episode is not merely a historical account. It is a living testimony that God fulfills his promises, even when everything seems lost. 70 years earlier, the prophet Jeremiah had announced that the exile would have a fixed duration, and Isaiah, even earlier, had already mentioned Cyrus by name, before he was even born. This shows that for God, nothing in history comes as a surprise. He governs kings, empires, and even hearts. At that moment, the Persian Empire became more than a geopolitical power. It became an instrument of God's grace. Even though it was not a nation that feared the Lord, it was used to bring freedom, restoration, and the fulfillment of prophecy. That is why we can say that Persia held a place of honor in the pages of the Bible, even if only for a brief time. This moment also teaches us something profound. God can use whomever he wants, whenever he wants, in whatever way he wants. Even a pagan king can be an instrument in the hands of the Most High. What matters is not where the person comes from, but who is guiding the story behind the scenes. What began with a discreet name in Genesis chapter 10, Elam, developed over the centuries into a powerful nation called Persia, which would be remembered not only for its military victories, but for its direct role in the redemptive plans of the God of Israel. And so the fall of Babylon into the hands of Cyrus was not merely a transfer of power between empires. It was an act of redemption, a divine intervention, a proof that God never forgets his people. Even when everything seems lost, he continues to move the pieces on the board. And in this chapter of history, the most powerful throne in the world was bowed to the will of the God of Israel. Over time, the spiritual atmosphere surrounding the Persian throne began to shift. Cyrus, who had once been an instrument of restoration in the hands of God, was now part of the past. Other kings rose with different priorities, personalities, and motivations. Among them, a striking name appears: Ahasuerus, also known in history as Xerxes I. His reign is portrayed in detail in the book of Esther, and in it, we witness one of the darkest moments in the relationship between the Persian Empire and the people of God. Ahasuerus was a powerful king who ruled over 127 provinces, an immense empire that stretched from India to Ethiopia. But with all that power also came the vulnerability of a heart easily influenced. And it was precisely this weakness that created space for the rise of a disguised enemy, Haman the Agagite. Haman was not just any official. He was elevated by the king to a position of very high authority, and with that, he began to demand reverence from everyone. However, there was a Jewish man named Mordecai who refused to bow before him. Mordecai was a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin, and his fear of God prevented him from honoring someone who embodied arrogance and hatred. This refusal inflamed Haman's pride, and he decided not only to take revenge on Mordecai, but to exterminate the entire Jewish people scattered throughout the empire. A diabolical plan was being set in motion. Haman convinced King Ahasuerus to sign a decree ordering the destruction of the Jews on a specific date. As was customary among the Persians, once such a decree was sealed with the royal signet ring, it could not be revoked. Panic spread among the Jews. They were on the verge of being annihilated across all Persian territory. The same nation that had once allowed their rebuilding now threatened their existence. But God had not remained silent. In the midst of the Persian court, there was a woman placed there by him with an eternal purpose: Esther. Esther was Mordecai's cousin and had been chosen as queen after a beauty contest that brought her to the palace. But the king did not know she was Jewish. When Mordecai learned of the death decree, he sent an urgent message to Esther saying, "Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther chapter 4, verse 14. Esther, fearing for her own life, hesitated. To present herself before the king without being summoned was an act that could cost her life. But after fasting for 3 days, she decided to act with courage and faith. She put on her royal robes and entered the presence of the king. The moment was decisive. Ahasuerus could lift the scepter and grant her favor, or he could command her execution. But God was there. The heart of the king was moved, and he extended the scepter. Esther was heard. With wisdom, she did not accuse Haman immediately. She organized 2 banquets, during which she exposed the extermination plot with both delicacy and firmness. Ahasuerus, shocked to discover that his queen belonged to the threatened people, rose in anger against Haman. The enemy of the Jews was hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. But there was still a problem. The decree ordering the death of the Jews was still in effect. So, a new decree was written by order of the king, authorizing the Jews to defend themselves. And so, on the day appointed for their destruction, the Jews triumphed over their enemies. This episode shows once again how God never loses control of history, not even within the most powerful palaces in the world. Even when everything seemed lost, he had already prepared someone, placed in the right place at the right time to prevent the tragedy. The book of Esther does not mention the name of God directly, but his hand is in every detail, in the favor of the king, in Esther's wisdom, in Haman's exposure, and in the salvation of the people. It was more than a political victory. It was the preservation of the divine promise that through the Jews the Messiah would come. The Persian Empire, which had once been an instrument of deliverance in the days of Cyrus, now nearly became an agent of destruction. But God intervened. And just as he had used Cyrus in the past, now he used Esther and Mordecai. Because the faithfulness of the Lord does not depend on the faithfulness of empires, it depends on his own faithfulness. For a time, the Persian Empire seemed unshakable. Its armies ruled from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, and its riches filled luxurious palaces. The Persian people, descendants of the ancient Elamites, had been used by God to fulfill great purposes, as we saw with King Cyrus. However, even after taking part in the restoration of Israel, the Persian Empire did not remain faithful to divine justice. The same people who had once been instruments in the hands of the Lord began to follow a dangerous path, the path of idolatry, pride, and self-sufficiency. The Bible, always faithful in revealing both the mercy and justice of God, had already warned the world about this. In Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 through 39, the prophet announces a direct judgment against Elam, the people from whom the Persians descend. He says, "Behold, I will break the bow of Elam, the chief of their might." This bow represented military power, the trust in weaponry and domination. God was saying, "I myself will disarm this nation." And it was not just a temporary defeat. Jeremiah goes on to say that Elam would be scattered to the four winds, like leaves carried by a storm, a strong image of dispersion, humiliation, and helplessness. In Ezekiel chapter 32, verse 24, the scene is even darker. The prophet sees Elam in the realm of the dead, among the nations that perished by the sword, whose iniquities had spread terror in the land of the living. They were defeated not only militarily, but spiritually. They were among those who challenged the holiness of God and reaped the consequences. Historically, what the Bible prophesied began to be fulfilled shortly after the golden era of the Persian Empire. With the death of Darius I and later Xerxes I, Ahasuerus, husband of Esther, the empire began to show signs of decline. The arrogance of the succeeding kings increased, as did their departure from moral principles. The Persian courts became centers of vanity, lust, and corruption. The rulers began to believe they were invincible, that their dominion would last forever. But they forgot something essential. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 34. The people in turn suffered under heavy taxes and inequality. Many conquered nations were weary of Persian domination. Internal revolts were increasing. The empire, although vast in territory, was fractured from within. It was only a matter of time before someone from outside would notice this weakness. And then came Alexander the Great, the young king of Macedonia. At only 20 years old, he began a military campaign that would span continents. Upon encountering the Persian Empire, Alexander found a structure weakened from within. The great battle took place at Gaugamela in the year 331 before Christ, where Darius III, the last Persian king, was defeated. Persia fell. The prophecy was fulfilled. It was not merely a change of empires, it was the judgment of God manifesting in history, just as he had promised. Those who once liberated the people of Israel were now falling because they had forgotten who was in control. The ruins of the Persian Empire are not just marks of the passage of time, but an eternal reminder that no nation, no matter how powerful it may seem, can stand if it despises divine justice. But even here, in the midst of collapse, the Bible does not end the story with a cold full stop. The same God who judges is also the God who keeps a promise of restoration, and that will be addressed at the end of this video. What we learn from the fall of Persia is that the hand of God guides the highs and lows of history. He raises up kings, brings down empires, and always fulfills his word. And for those who believe, every prophecy, even those of judgment, serves as a warning but also as an invitation, a call to live in humility, justice, and obedience to the King of Kings. For centuries, the name Persia echoed through history as a symbol of one of the greatest empires the ancient world had ever known. With kings like Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes, the Persian Empire left a deep mark on the pages of the Bible. But times changed, and with the change of eras, the name changed as well. In the year 1935, by decision of the government of that time, ancient Persia was officially renamed Iran. It was an attempt to affirm a new identity, more aligned with the Aryan origin of the Iranian people. However, for the Bible, the name Persia still carries weight, especially in prophecy. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38, when the prophet describes a future war, a coalition of nations against Israel led by a mysterious figure named Gog, Persia is mentioned as part of that alliance. This is significant. Even though the Bible does not use the name Iran, the text shows that the direct descendant of Elam and Persia will be involved in the end times events. It is a direct connection between past and future. Think about it. The people who were once used by God to free the Jews, rebuild Jerusalem and restore the temple, may be the same ones who in the last days will turn against Israel. It is a stunning prophetic reversal. Modern Iran, with all its political and religious tension toward Israel, seems to be heading in a direction very similar to what Ezekiel described millennia ago. This is not mere speculation, but rather the observation of signs and the understanding that biblical prophecies remain alive, waiting for their time of fulfillment. But there is something even deeper in this narrative. Even with the possible involvement of Iran in a scene of judgment and war, the mercy of God remains open. There in Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 39, God declares, "In the last days I will restore the fortunes of Elam." In other words, despite all the idolatry, arrogance, and even rebellion that marked this lineage, the heart of God still longs to restore that people. And this is where the present story connects to the ancient prophecy. Today, thousands of Iranians are coming to know the gospel. In secret, amid persecution and censorship, underground churches are growing. Men and women who until a short time ago lived under radical Islam are having personal encounters with Christ through dreams, visions, and quiet preaching. What seemed impossible in human eyes is happening before the world, and many scholars see this as the beginning of the fulfillment of that promise from Jeremiah. This is the beauty of the scriptures. They not only recount what once was, but they also reveal what is yet to come. The journey of Persia, or rather of Iran, is not fully written. It is still unfolding, and the ending will depend on how hearts respond to God's call. Therefore, as we look to the Bible, we see that a people may begin as allies of God, go astray, be judged, but may also be restored. Modern Iran stands at this point of decision. The Bible shows that the stage is set, and now it is up to each generation including the modern descendants of Elam, to choose whether they will be instruments of judgment or of redemption. Now write in the comments if you already knew the story of the Persian Empire in the Bible. Share this teaching with more people, leave a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming content. May God bless your life, and may you remain firm in the ways of the Lord.